Hey everyone, I'm back again. My name is Tony DiGerolamo. I'm a screenwriter and here with some screenwriting tips. Today's tip, we're going to talk about how to write a science fiction screenplay or sci-fi screenplay as they call it. All right, so sci-fi. It's a genre I'm pretty familiar with, and I think most of you out there have seen a lot of sci-fi. Obviously, you've probably seen Star Wars and Star Trek. You know, in the world of sci-fi, those franchises are kind of for the tourist, right? I mean, they're great, not knocking them, especially the original Star Trek, but at the same time, they're kind of the simpler sci-fi stories. You know, they're the fun ones. They use the trappings of sci-fi, I think, more than they are a sci-fi entity unto themselves. You know, when you look at Star Wars is really more of a adventure serial about heroes and villains and, and stuff like that. Star Trek is really more space exploration kind of thing about a group of friends and being in the military together and exploring new worlds. The sci-fi is definitely a major part of it, but it could probably be removed in both of those franchises, and you would still have, you know, those stories. You could just set them in the modern era and, you know, take out the aliens and robots or replace them with people, and you probably could run the same stories. The stuff that's on the end of the bell curve, the stuff that's, maybe you'd call it a hard sci-fi or hard science fiction, is the stuff that, you know, it's really researched well. You know, stuff like Matt Damon, The Martian, right? That was all done with a lot of research behind it. It was based on the book, and, you know, it was all, you know, it was something that could potentially be done, you know, as opposed to something like Interstellar, where it's kind of trying to approach that, but, you know, doesn't quite make it, because ultimately it's more about Matthew McConaughey's relationship with his daughter and using sci-fi to sort of facilitate that revelation at the end. You know, not to say that it's not based on some theories, but, you know, hard science fiction would be, yeah, that's probably the way it is, or could be, or potentially. I mean, not that they don't take some liberties, but they take fewer liberties. The sci-fi classic 2001: A Space Odyssey is probably the best example, up until the end, I guess. It's you know, the aliens themselves. It's also a hard movie to understand if you haven't read the books. I mean, you can understand most of it up to a point, and then the end, you don't get an explanation. You get sort of a visual explanation that you can take away from that, and you can either make up your own explanation for it, or you can read the book and then go, oh, okay, that's what happened to Dave. He spoilers, many spoilers ahead. Dave evolved and becomes that crazy space baby at the end. I think it was called like the Epsilon Child or something like that. But read the book if you haven't. It's a pretty good book. And then they had a sequel to the movie and a sequel to the book. I would recommend probably the book over the movie for the sequel, but teach his own. One of the key elements in writing a sci-fi screenplay is the science has to impact the people, the plot, and the story, you know, in a significant way. When you look at a TV series like The Walking Dead, for instance, in a lot of ways, that, you know, could be a sci-fi story. It shares similarities with a sci-fi story in that the disease that creates the zombies that's from science, albeit not real science, obviously, but it has that sci-fi bent to it. Um, the thing about sci-fi is this: you can follow the three-act structure. That would definitely work for your Star Wars and Star Trek type sci-fi movies because they're more focused on the other elements, and the sci-fi is more of the decoration, right? Um, but for a real sci-fi movie, if you look at 2001: A Space Odyssey, it kind of follows that three-act structure. Not really, because that final sequence, you know, you don't really get it. It's like the real point of the movie is beyond your grasp. I mean, that's the amazing thing about Kubrick's movie is it creates it creates a feeling like, wow, I don't understand this, and that's kind of what, if you read the book, it's all about. It's humans are trying to understand these aliens, and it's kind of like beyond their reasoning what they're doing. They're doing something, but we don't quite understand it. And is it aliens, or is it God, or is it some godlike alien, or whatever? We don't know. So that part of the unknown is very key in that movie, and it's usually key in a lot of other sci-fi movies, that unknown quantity, like if we take science and use it in some way, what will happen? The classic example is Frankenstein. And that's the classic story of man playing God. We've gone too far with science. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do with this science? And ultimately somebody they go too far and they're punished for it. It's a very classic sort of sci-fi plot. But ultimately, the closer you are to science fiction, the closer you are to talking about big concepts, right? And if you can talk about those big concepts and how they impact the world and humanity in a way that's still entertaining, you've really done your job as a screenwriter. But it's very tough. Science fiction movies, they require usually a fair amount of research if you want those details to work. If you look at some of these movies and how they unfold and the science behind them, if they're consistent. Now, sometimes you take a movie like Independence Day. Independence Day doesn't really have much science about it, right? I mean, it kind of doesn't make sense, spoiler, at the end of the movie when Jeff Goldblum uploads a computer virus into the alien ship to save the day. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Like, alien computers would be vulnerable to viruses from our computer. I mean, you could understand why Hollywood did that, because it's sort of an homage to War of the Worlds, because that's what kills the Martians at the end of that classic Orson Welles radio play. The Martians come and they're beating the hell out of us, but a virus, hits them, and they realize they can't win, and a bunch of them die, and then they, fall over themselves trying to retreat. So if you have the elements of that big concept and it's related to science, you've got a sci-fi movie. If you have, basically a typical three-act action movie, or a three-act comedy movie, or a three-act horror movie, you have a horror movie with sci-fi trappings. So if you look at Alien is basically a monster movie in a spaceship, right? It's a horror movie in a spaceship. It's a haunted house. You could take that movie, change the alien to, a guy in a hockey mask killing everybody, or Ghost, or a werewolf or something like that, and you could basically have the same movie play out, on in an isolated place, a group of coworkers who are trying to get home. Maybe they're on a ship, it would play out pretty similarly. So it's not that it's not a sci-fi movie and there aren't elements there, but the crux of the plot in Alien really is about the suspense and the unknown of the alien, but you could flip that to something supernatural and it'd be basically the same movie. In 2001, that would be really tough, I think. I mean, I don't know what kind of movie you'd have if you just changed it to, I guess you'd have to change it to some unknown thing. Maybe you could make it, I don't think you can make it supernatural, it won't work, but, I mean, you could change anything enough, you could change it, but, at some point it's just not the same plot. So, when I'm working on sci-fi, the first thing I'd like to do is try to get all the information you can, go beyond Wikipedia and read some articles, read newer stuff if you can, because you kind of want to be ahead of the curve. Science changes over the course of years, and if you're basing your whole screenplay off a theory that's either been disproven or is out of vogue, that could spell problems for you, especially if something hits in the news that completely discounts it, and you're stuck with this plot based around a theory that nobody believes anymore. They're constantly finding archaeological evidence that man, existed earlier and earlier. Now they've found archaeological evidence that maybe we didn't spring forth from Africa, that humans may have evolved somewhere else first or at the same time, So there's always new scientific research. So, I mean, there's a limit, of course. It kind of depends on how, if you're doing hard science fiction, man, you got to do it all. You got to know your stuff. If you're doing something a little lighter, but I think in Interstellar, what hurt that movie was, although it was based on pretty good scientific theory, ultimately it felt a little rushed and slapped together and not real by the end, in my opinion. It started out kind of slow, and then once it got into the sci-fi, it felt like they were on the one hand they were making it up, but what they were making up was pretty minor. And then at the end with the aliens and the books, it felt a little too contrived just to tell the story of the father's and daughter's relationship. It felt like they were bending all this scientific theory just to do that melodrama, and it made it overblown for me. Not that it wasn't smart, and it was based on interesting theories about creatures who live in other dimensions, and that's something to research. A big argument that you've probably had with your friends in the world of sci-fi is time travel. You bring time travel in, you're opening up a huge can of worms, because the obvious question is, why don't the characters go back in time and prevent the problem before it ever starts? And that's a real question that, you also have to, people don't time travel. So you have to know the rules of your particular universe's time travel, right? So in the movie Time Cop, if you've ever seen that, the rule was you can time travel and you can change the past, but you can never make contact with yourself. If you ever touched yourself, you die. So that was an interesting take in that movie, and that was all key to the plot. But again, that was more like trappings. Then you got a movie like, one of my favorite time travel movies is Time After Time, starring that was Roddy McDowall, and he plays H.G. Wells, who goes forward in time to the modern era, but the movie was shot in the 80s, and it's a whole Jack the Ripper thing. It's great movie. I highly recommend it. But again, the time travel in that movie is more like magic. You know, they don't really explain it at all, other than H.G. Wells somehow built a time machine and it works. So, you know, actual time travel, the science on that, you know, it's very complicated. It's near impossible. I think they said now that they've come up with a potential way you could possibly time travel, but they don't have much information. Basically, you know, the broader answer is that you can't time travel because you'd have to go faster than the speed of light and you'd die. So, so time travel movies tend to be these fun movies where it's just an excuse to have Marty McFly, you know, meet his mom and dad when they were young. You know, those kinds of movies. So, you know, again, the science is this fun, crazy thing, but it's not real science. It's more of a device to make the movie happen. So I think you should stay away from time travel. It's a really, I love time travel movies. I'm absolutely obsessed with them. I will see almost any time travel movie for any reason, with few exceptions, but you know, because I love to get into how do they make time travel happen in this movie, you know. But a lot of times I'm disappointed in the movie because they either are inconsistent or they just don't have a good idea how it works. You know, like on Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, right? They had a concept that they could sort of just remind themselves, oh, we'll go back in time and we'll change X, or we'll change Y, and we'll change Z. Which is fun because it's, you know, it's a comedy movie, so you can get away with it. But, you know, ultimately, when you stop to think about it, you know, that really wouldn't work, of course. I mean, it really wouldn't work even within the confines of that crazy movie. Because it would be too, you know, they needed the phone booth to go back in time and they couldn't do it that quickly. So, anyhow, that's a big a thing you have to do in a sci-fi movie. In all movies, when you create a world, you create your own physics in your universe, whatever that is. You know, in a comedy universe, it tends to be a little looser. In a drama, it tends to be more realistic. Horror, it tends to be more supernatural. And in sci-fi, it can be loose to not very loose at all, depending on where you are. But it has to be consistent. So in a time travel movie, if your laws are consistent, if your time travel laws are consistent, you can make it work. You know, even though it's totally made up, even though, you know, anybody will tell you, oh, that'll never work. As long as it's relatively consistent in your movie, the audience will tend to buy it as long as you can justify it enough. In the famous French short La Jetée, you know, the concept was you could time travel by taking drugs and hypnotizing yourself. And so, you know, you can do lots with the concept. Any concept that's unknown, and this is the great thing about science fiction, you can play with it a little. Because since we don't know, you could just make up your own rules. The only danger is, you know, you look at something like The Martian Chronicles, written by the late great Ray Bradbury. You know, we already know what the surface of Mars looks like now, and we know it's not filled with all old ruins of the Martians. And we know there's not an atmosphere up there, and so, you know, that kind of stuff is now dated. It's like Forbidden Planet or any of the other old sci-fi worlds. We now know they don't work. You could still do them, but they're kind of retro, and it's harder to sell to your audience unless you're selling them, hey, this is just a wacky retro science fiction-y thing from the 50s or whatever. So, as always, do your research and keep your worlds consistent. Follow the 3-act structure as best you can. It's going to get a little difficult in the sci-fi movie. Maybe sometime we'll get into more detail, talk about how you can really tackle these big concepts. But if you know them, you'll figure out a way. So that's really the key. Knowledge is the key. All right. Good luck on writing your sci-fi screenplay. My name is Tony D. Check me out on the Webcomic Factory, Superfat, and Patreon. I'll see you next time.